Have you ever stopped to ask why the Bible spends so much time to odds?
Baal, Molech, and Dagon. Why does Scripture treat these figures as instead of illusions? But what if that explanation is dangerously incomplete? What if the Bible itself is telling us something far more unsettling?
Have you ever stopped to ask why the Bible spends so much time talking about other gods? If there is only one true God, why does the Old Testament read like a battlefield? Yahweh clashing again and again with dark names like Baal, Molech, and Dagon. Why does Scripture treat these figures as enemies instead of illusions? Most of us were taught a simple answer. They were just statues. People back then were ignorant. Wood and stone, nothing more. But what if that explanation is dangerously incomplete? What if the Bible itself is telling us something far more unsettling, that behind the stone and the wood were real, intelligent, hostile spiritual beings demanding loyalty, blood, and worship? When you slow down and actually read the text, a disturbing pattern emerges. The Bible is not merely a record of human mistakes. It is the story of a cosmic war, a war between the Most High God and rebellious spiritual powers determined to enslave humanity. To understand Scripture, you must understand its enemies. And to do that, we have to step back and look at a scene most readers never notice. Psalm 82. It opens with a shocking image. God stands in the great assembly. He renders judgment among the gods. God is not alone. He is surrounded. For centuries, many tried to explain this away. They're just human judges, they said. But human rulers do not stand in heaven. The word used here is Elohim, a term that refers to beings of the spiritual realm. These were not idols. They were not metaphors. They were created spiritual rulers, members of God's heavenly council assigned authority over the nations. And they failed. To understand how, we must go back to one of the most explosive moments in the Bible, the Tower of Babel. After humanity rebelled, God did something radical. According to Deuteronomy, He divided the nations and handed them over not to chaos, but to spiritual rulers. When the Most High divided mankind, He fixed the borders of the peoples according to the number of the sons of God. Older manuscripts make it even clearer. Sons of God, not sons of Israel. God chose Israel for Himself, but He placed the other nations under the supervision of these spiritual beings. And that is where everything went wrong. Instead of guiding the nations toward the Creator, these rulers corrupted their authority. They demanded worship. They twisted justice. They enslaved the people they were meant to protect. They became the gods of the Old Testament. This is why biblical history feels like warfare, because it is. Yahweh is not competing with imaginary idols. He is reclaiming the nations from rebellious powers. Now that we understand the battlefield, let's look at the faces of the enemy. No name appears more often or more dangerously than Baal. Baal was not a minor idol. He was Israel's greatest rival god. Why? Because Baal was believed to control rain. In the ancient world, rain meant survival. No rain meant famine. Famine meant death. Baal wasn't just a god, he was the economy, the harvest, the future. The people believed Baal rode the clouds. That thunder was his voice, that he battled the sea and death to bring life to the land. Israel's temptation was subtle but deadly. Yahweh can give us laws and history, but Baal controls the weather. It was a crisis of trust. Baal worship was violent, desperate, loud. It demanded blood. And nothing exposes this better than Mount Carmel. Elijah versus the prophets of Baal. A showdown over who truly controlled the sky. The prophets screamed for hours. They danced. They slashed their own flesh until blood poured down their bodies. They tried to force their God to act. And Scripture records the most chilling sentence in the chapter. There was no response. No one answered. No one paid attention. Then Elijah prayed. No frenzy. No blood. No performance. Fire fell. Rain followed. Yahweh proved something eternal. False gods take everything from you, your dignity, your body, your fear, and give nothing back. The God of Scripture gives grace. False gods demand payment. Right beside Baal stood another dangerous figure, Asherah. She was the mother goddess, the symbol of fertility and life, often described as the consort of the high god El or even Baal himself. Her worship looked harmless on the surface, trees, poles, nature imagery, but the rituals were anything but pure. Asherah worship involved ritual prostitution. Sexual acts were performed at shrines to stimulate the gods into blessing the land. Marriage was stripped of covenant. Human bodies became tools. God hated it not because he feared pleasure, but because it dehumanized his creation. What made Asherah even more dangerous was where she appeared, not outside Israel. Inside it, her symbols were brought into the temple itself. King Manasseh placed an image of Asherah inside the house of God, a direct insult to the Creator. It was syncretism, mixing truth with corruption. And Scripture is clear. God does not share his house. This is the pattern repeated again and again in the Bible. These were not harmless myths. They were not cultural misunderstandings. They were rebellious spiritual powers feeding on fear, blood, sex, and control. And the story of Scripture is the story of Yahweh dismantling their rule, nation by nation, heart by heart. For many people, Baal and Asherah were still not enough. Yahweh, the creator of heaven and earth, was no longer sufficient. They wanted insurance. They wanted a backup plan. They wanted a nature goddess, a fertility power, something they could manipulate to feel safe. And that mindset opened the door to something far darker. Now we descend into the most horrifying name in the biblical record, Molech. If Baal was about the economy and Asherah about pleasure, Molech was about terror. Molech was not merely a false god. He was a nightmare given a name. Associated with the Ammonites, Molech demanded a sacrifice so evil that it still turns the stomach of modern readers, children. The Bible uses a chilling phrase, to make one's children pass through the fire. Do not give any of your children to be sacrificed to Molech, the Lord commands, for you must not profane the name of your God. This was not poetic language. History and archaeology tell us that Molech was often represented as a massive metal idol, bull's head, human body, arms outstretched. A fire was lit beneath or inside the statue until the metal glowed red hot. Parents would then place their infants into those burning arms. Why would anyone do this? Not because they hated their children, but because they were afraid. They believed that if they sacrificed the most precious thing they had, their own offspring, the god would be obligated to protect their city, save their harvest, or secure their future. It was fear-driven self-preservation at its most grotesque. The present generation buying comfort by destroying the next. And this horror did not stay outside Israel. In the valley of Hinnom, just outside Jerusalem, Israelites built high places to Molech. The prophet Jeremiah records God's response not with rage, but with shock. They built high places to sacrifice their sons and daughters, something I never commanded, nor did it even enter my mind. That phrase matters. God is saying, this is utterly foreign to who I am. Yahweh is the giver of life. He protects the weak. Molech does the opposite. Molech consumes the innocent. This is the true nature of false gods. They take, they never give. They steal, kill, and destroy. This spiritual conflict did not begin in Canaan. It goes back to Egypt, when Moses stood before Pharaoh and said, "Let my people go." It was not just a political confrontation. It was a theological war. Egypt was saturated with gods, the Nile, the sun, animals, fertility, death. Pharaoh himself was worshipped as divine. And when the 10 plagues came, they were not random disasters. Each one was a calculated strike against a specific Egyptian deity. The Nile turned to blood, direct judgment on Hapi, god of the river. The frogs overwhelmed the land, mocking Heket, goddess of fertility. Darkness fell for 3 days, silencing Ra, the supreme sun god. God didn't argue with Egypt's gods. He dismantled them. "I will bring judgment on all the gods of Egypt," the Lord declared. "I am Yahweh." As Israel later encountered the Philistines, another name emerged: Dagon. Dagon was the chief god of the Philistine pantheon, associated with grain, fertility, and sometimes sea imagery. When the Philistines captured the Ark of the Covenant, they believed they had defeated Yahweh himself. They placed the Ark in Dagon's temple as a trophy. That night, something happened. When the priests returned in the morning, they found Dagon face down before the Ark, bowing. They panicked. They picked their god up and set him back in place. That alone should have been the warning. A god you have to lift is not much of a god. The next morning, it was worse. Dagon had fallen again, but this time his head and hands were broken off, lying on the threshold. Wisdom gone, power severed. Yahweh needed no army, no speech, no negotiation. Even in enemy territory, he was king. And sometimes the most dangerous false god is not a foreign demon, it is the god we invent ourselves. At Mount Sinai, just days after being rescued from Egypt, Israel built the golden calf, not to reject Yahweh but to reshape him. They said, "These are your gods who brought you out of Egypt." They wanted a god they could see, touch, control, a god who fit their expectations. This is the most subtle idolatry of all, claiming faith while redefining God to accommodate comfort, fear, and sin. And Scripture's warning is relentless. The moment we remake God in our image, we stop worshipping Him and start worshipping ourselves. We create a God who exists to serve us, a God who wants us rich, a God who never confronts, a God who never judges, a God who never says no. But that God does not exist in Scripture. That God is a golden calf. When Israel reshaped Yahweh into something comfortable, God did not shrug. He burned with anger. He told Moses plainly, "These people have corrupted themselves. You cannot reshape the Creator. You cannot domesticate the Holy One." The moment we remake God in our own image, or the image of our culture, we are no longer worshipping Him, even if we still use His name. That same corruption infected Israel's neighbors. To the east was Moab, whose national god was Chemosh. Like Molech, Chemosh was a blood-soaked deity. Scripture often groups them together because their cruelty was indistinguishable. One scene in the Bible is so disturbing that readers still struggle to process it. Israel was winning a battle against Moab. The Moabite king was desperate. Defeat was imminent. So he did the unthinkable. He took his firstborn son, the crown prince, his future, and sacrificed him on the city wall, in full view of both armies. The text says, "Great wrath came against Israel." What does that mean? Some scholars believe the psychological horror of witnessing such an act shattered Israel's resolve. Others argue something darker, that a real spiritual force was unleashed. Either way, the message is unmistakable. Chemosh owned his people through fear. To reject Chemosh was to reject being Moabite itself. This is how false gods still work. They fuse themselves to national identity, politics, and tribal loyalty. They whisper, "If you don't bow to me, you're betraying your people." Even Solomon fell for it. The wisest man who ever lived, the builder of the temple. In his old age, his heart drifted. On a hill east of Jerusalem, Solomon built a high place for Chemosh, the detestable god of Moab, and for Molech, the abomination of the Ammonites. Let that sink in. The man who built God's house also built altars to monsters. Wisdom does not make you immune. Power does not protect you. If you stop guarding your heart, the spirit of the age will seduce you. Jeremiah exposes this delusion in brutal clarity. After Judah fled to Egypt, Jeremiah told them their disaster came from idol worship. They argued back. They pointed to a goddess they called the Queen of Heaven, likely Ishtar or Astarte. They said, "When we worshipped her, we had food. When we stopped, war came." They mistook God's patience for the idol's blessing. False gods often reward briefly. Greed pays for a season. Pleasure feels good for a while. But the bill always comes due. And when Babylon arrived, the Queen of Heaven did nothing. Then there is the strangest case of all, the bronze serpent. Originally, it was commanded by God, a tool of mercy. In the wilderness, anyone bitten by snakes who looked at it in faith lived. But centuries later, Israel turned the object into an idol. They burned incense to it. They worshipped the gift instead of the giver. King Hezekiah shattered it and mocked it with a name, Nehushtan, a mere piece of bronze. This is a warning to every generation. God-given things, traditions, leaders, churches, movements can become idols. Sometimes obedience means smashing what once helped you. The war does not end in the Old Testament. In Acts, Paul enters Ephesus, the city of Artemis, one of the wonders of the ancient world. Artemis was not just a goddess, she was an economy, a billion-dollar religion. Silver shrines fueled livelihoods. When Paul preached that gods made by human hands are no gods at all, people believed. Sales collapsed, and a silversmith named Demetrius started a riot. Notice his concern, not truth. Income. When idols fall, economies panic. For hours the crowd screamed, "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians." Not because she was true, but because she paid the bills. That is the final mask of false gods. They don't just demand worship, they demand silence. And they rage when exposed. The names change. The spirits do not. And the war continues. They filled the stadium and screamed for hours, "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians." Not because she was true, but because she was profitable. This was not worship. It was noise designed to suffocate truth. This is the God of commerce, the God that declares money more sacred than reality, the God that panics the moment the gospel threatens profit margins. Whenever Jesus confronts a system that exploits people, that system responds exactly the same way Ephesus did: rage, chaos, intimidation. Scripture pulls the curtain back and reveals something far more disturbing. Baal, Molech, Chemosh, Artemis. Different names, same source. They are masks. The Apostle Paul says it without hesitation. The sacrifices of pagans are offered to demons, not to God. Behind every idol stands a demon. Behind every myth, a fallen angel. And above them all, Satan himself, whom Paul calls the God of this age. This God does not always need statues. He uses ideas. He uses pride. He uses false philosophies. His goal is blindness. If gold idols work, he uses gold. If careers work, he uses ambition. If politics work, he uses ideology. If smartphones work, he uses distraction. Jesus named the most dangerous false god of the modern world, Mammon. Not merely money, but wealth personified. A rival master. You cannot serve both God and Mammon. Mammon gives orders. Cheat a little. Don't give what if you need it later? Your worth is what you own. Mammon promises security. But like Baal, it enslaves. The Bible does not end with these gods winning. It ends with their execution. When Jesus arrived, the spiritual powers recognized him immediately. Demons screamed before he spoke. Storms obeyed him. Death retreated. When he calmed the sea, he dethroned Baal. When he fed the crowds, he humiliated the fertility gods. When he raised the dead, he shattered every myth of the underworld. Then came the cross. What looked like defeat was a trap. Paul reveals what happened unseen. He disarmed the powers and authorities and made a public spectacle of them. The cross stripped them naked. The resurrection declared their defeat. All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. That means Baal has none. Molech has none. Mammon has none. They still lie. They still deceive. But they rule nothing. So, who are the false gods? They are defeated spirits begging for your devotion. In ancient times, they used temples. Today, they use culture. The question Elijah asked still echoes. How long will you waver between two opinions? The idols are many. God is one. And he is jealous not from insecurity, but because he alone gives life. The war is real. The victory is complete. The only question left is this: whom will you serve?